It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway for Amanda and her friends. They had found a beautiful flat on Airbnb, nestled in the heart of a quiet village surrounded by lush greenery. They couldn't wait to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and unwind in the idyllic countryside. As they pulled up to the flat, they were struck by how charming it was. It was an old building with thick stone walls, wooden shutters, and a red-tiled roof. The door creaked open as they entered, and they were greeted by a musty smell and a dimly lit hallway. The owner, a wizened old man, showed them around the flat and handed them the keys before disappearing into the shadows. Amanda and her friends settled in, eager to explore their new surroundings. But as night fell, strange things began to happen. The doors would creak open and shut on their own. The windows would rattle even though there was no wind, and they heard strange whispers and footsteps coming from the walls. Amanda tried to shrug it off, thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But when she woke up in the middle of the night, she realized that something was seriously wrong. She was lying on the floor, her head throbbing, and she couldn't remember how she got there. As she looked around, she realized that the furniture had been moved, and the room looked completely different. She stumbled out of the room, calling out to her friends, but they were nowhere to be found. The flat was silent, except for the sound of her own panicked breathing. She frantically searched every corner of the flat, but there was no sign of her friends. The walls seemed to be closing in on her, and she could feel eyes watching her from the shadows. That's when she noticed something written on the wall in blood-red letters. "You are not alone." Amanda knew she had to get out of there. She grabbed her bag and ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. She could hear the whispers getting louder and the footsteps getting closer. She knew she was running out of time. Suddenly, the door flew open and the old man appeared in the doorway. He had a twisted smile on his face and his eyes gleamed with a sinister light. Amanda realized too late that the flat was not what it seemed and that they had stumbled into a trap. The old man's voice echoed through the flat as he spoke his final words. "Welcome to your nightmare." Amanda's heart was pounding in her chest as she realized the full horror of her situation. She was trapped in a strange flat, with no idea where her friends were or what was happening to them. The old man was blocking her only escape route, and she knew she was no match for him. She backed away slowly, trying to keep her eyes on the old man. But as she reached for her phone to call for help, he suddenly lunged at her. Amanda screamed as she felt his bony fingers wrap around her throat, cutting off her air supply. She tried to fight back, clawing at his face and kicking him with all her might. But the old man was surprisingly strong, and she was weakening fast. As her vision began to blur and fade, she saw something move out of the corner of her eye. It was her friend Laura, stumbling out of a nearby room with a look of terror on her face. Laura saw what was happening and screamed, lunging at the old man with a nearby lamp. He turned to face her, his grip on Amanda's throat loosening just enough for her to gasp in a breath of air. Amanda felt herself slipping away, but she knew that she had to keep fighting. With all her strength, she pushed the old man away from her and scrambled to her feet. She ran towards the door, grabbing Laura's arm as she passed her. Together, they burst out into the night air, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. As they stumbled away from the flat, they could hear the old man laughing maniacally from inside. They knew they had to get help, but they had no idea where they were or how to contact the police. They stumbled through the darkness, their hearts pounding with every step. Finally, they saw the lights of a nearby village in the distance. They ran towards them, hoping to find help and safety. But as they drew closer, they realized that something was wrong. The village was eerily quiet, and there was a strange smell in the air. Amanda and Laura exchanged a terrified glance, realizing that their nightmare was far from over. They had stumbled into something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. And as they continued towards the village, they knew that they were walking straight into the jaws of death. Girls knew they had to keep moving, even though the village seemed completely deserted. They tried knocking on doors and calling out for help, but there was no response. The streets were dark and empty, and they could feel a growing sense of unease and despair. Just when they thought all was lost, they saw a light flickering in the distance. They cautiously approached, not knowing what to expect. As they drew closer, they realized that it was a small house with a warm, inviting glow coming from the windows. They knocked on the door, barely daring to hope that someone would answer. But to their immense relief, an elderly couple opened the door and welcomed them inside. They were kind and friendly, and Amanda and Laura felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for them. The couple listened to their story and offered them a warm meal and a safe place to rest. Amanda and Laura felt like they had finally found peace, and they were overcome with emotion. Over the next few days, they recovered from their ordeal and slowly pieced together what had happened to them. It turned out that the flat they had rented was part of a larger network of properties run by a cult who lured unsuspecting tourists into their grasp and used them for their twisted rituals. The Airbnb house was the perfect escape for a group of college friends who wanted to get away from their busy lives for a weekend. Located in the remote countryside, it was a beautiful old farmhouse with a large garden, a pool, and a hot tub. The group arrived on Friday evening and immediately fell in love with the house's rustic charm. They spent the first night drinking, laughing, and exploring the different rooms, each more fascinating than the last. But things quickly took a dark turn on the second night. It started with strange noises coming from the attic. The group dismissed it as just the old house settling, but as the night progressed, the noises grew louder and more persistent. They sounded like footsteps and scratching sounds, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the attic. The group tried to ignore the noises and go to sleep, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. One of them suggested going up to the attic to investigate, but the idea was quickly shot down. Nobody wanted to venture up there in the dark, especially after what they had heard. The next morning, they woke up to find the house in disarray. Furniture had been overturned, books were scattered on the floor, and there were strange scratch marks on the walls. They knew that something had happened during the night, but none of them could remember what. It was as if a blackout had occurred and their memories had been erased. The group tried to shrug off the strange events, thinking it was just a prank by one of them. They spent the day lounging by the pool and enjoying the beautiful weather. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the house became more tense and uncomfortable. The group huddled together, listening to the strange noises once again coming from the attic. They tried to call the owner of the Airbnb, but their phones were suddenly out of service. As the night wore on, the group became increasingly agitated and scared. They decided to search the house for any clues to what was happening, but they found nothing. They were about to give up and barricade themselves in one of the rooms when they heard a loud crash coming from the attic. It was followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed throughout the house. The group ran towards the stairs leading up to the attic, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were met with a gruesome sight. One of their friends lay motionless on the floor, his body contorted in a way that no human body should be. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, and there was a look of terror frozen on his face. They didn't know what to do. They were trapped in the house with no way out and no means of calling for help. They tried to revive their friend, but it was too late. They were alone and terrified, with no idea of what was happening to them. As they huddled together, trying to find a way out of the nightmare, they heard a voice. It was coming from the attic, and it was whispering their names. They knew that they had to leave the house, but they were paralyzed with fear. The voice grew louder and more insistent, and they knew that they had no choice but to confront whatever was up there. As they made their way up to the attic, the air grew colder and the whispering grew louder. They reached the top of the stairs and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a tall, thin figure with glowing eyes and a sinister grin on its face. It beckoned to them, and they knew that they had no choice but to follow. The group stumbled after the figure, feeling as if they were in a dream. They passed through rooms that seemed to twist and distort around them, as if they were in a funhouse. The figure led them to a room that looked like it had been ripped straight from a nightmare. There were strange symbols etched into the walls, and a putrid smell hung in the air. As they stood there, paralyzed with fear, the figure turned to face them. It spoke in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers, each one more sinister than the last. "You are mine now," it said. "You will never leave this place." The group screamed and ran, fleeing down the stairs and out of the house. They ran until they were far away from the Airbnb, not stopping until they collapsed from exhaustion. The next day, the police arrived at the Airbnb to investigate. What they found was a scene of horror. The walls were covered in It was supposed to be a dream vacation for Emma and her friends. They had decided to visit Eastern Europe, exploring new cultures and experiencing life outside their comfort zones. They found the perfect Airbnb flat in a small town that promised to offer an authentic local experience. The flat was quaint and cozy, with traditional decor and a charming balcony overlooking the town square. But there was something eerie about the place. The atmosphere was heavy, and every creak and groan of the old building made Emma's skin crawl. She tried to ignore it and focus on enjoying the trip, but the feeling only grew stronger as the days went by. One night, as they were sitting on the balcony, they heard strange noises coming from the flat next door. It sounded like someone was digging or hammering, but it was so loud that it couldn't be just a renovation. Emma tried to brush it off, assuming it was just a noisy neighbor, but the sounds continued for hours, well into the night. The next morning, Emma decided to investigate. She knocked on the door of the flat next door, but there was no answer. She tried to listen through the door, but the sounds had stopped. Emma started to feel uneasy. She decided to tell her friends, but they dismissed it as her overactive imagination. As the days passed, strange things continued to happen. Emma woke up one night to find the curtains in her room swaying as if there was a breeze, but all the windows were closed. Another day, she found a strange symbol etched onto the balcony railing, but no one had seen anyone come near it. Emma tried to rationalize everything, but her friends were becoming increasingly worried about her. They noticed how her demeanor had changed, how she was always on edge, and how she jumped at every noise. They decided to cut the trip short and head back home, hoping that it would help Emma snap out of her paranoia. But things only got worse when they returned to the flat. The noises from next door were louder than ever, and the symbol on the balcony had grown larger. Emma tried to call the Airbnb post, but the number was disconnected. They were trapped with no way out. Then one night they heard a knock on the door. Emma's heart raced as she slowly made her way to answer it. She opened the door to find a man standing there, wearing a dark cloak and a hood that concealed his face. The man didn't say a word, but Emma could feel his cold gaze piercing through her. The man handed her a piece of paper, which had a strange message written in a language she couldn't understand. She tried to ask him what it meant, but he had already disappeared into the night. Emma's friends were terrified, but Emma knew that they had to leave the flat immediately. They packed their bags and headed to the door, only to find that it was locked from the outside. They were trapped, with no way out. As the night wore on, Emma's fear turned into panic. They were running out of food and water, and the noises from next door were becoming louder and more frequent. They could hear strange chanting and the sound of footsteps coming closer. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the man in the cloak stood in front of them, holding a knife. Emma's friends screamed as he lunged towards them, but Emma stood her ground. She grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at him, hitting him square in the face. The man fell to the ground, and Emma and her friends took the opportunity to run out of the flat. They ran as fast as they could, not stopping until they reached the nearest police station. The police investigated the flat and found evidence of a dark cult that had been using it as a hideout. They discovered that the man in the cloak was a member of the cult, and that they had been performing dark rituals and sacrifices in the flat for years. Emma and her friends were hailed as heroes, and their story made headlines around the world. But as they were getting ready to return home, Emma received a message on her phone from an unknown number. It was a video of her and her friends in the flat, taken from a hidden camera. The message read, "We will never forget what you did to us. We will find you, and we will make you pay." Emma's heart sank as she realized that the nightmare wasn't over yet. The cult was still out there, and they were coming for her. She tried to hide her fear from her friends, but she knew that they were all in danger. They had to stay vigilant, and they had to watch their backs. The trip that was supposed to be a dream vacation had turned into a living nightmare, and it wasn't over yet. It was a warm summer evening when 5 friends arrived at their rented vacation house. The house was situated in a remote area surrounded by dense woods. The friends were excited to spend their summer vacation in this beautiful place, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The house was a 2-story building with a large porch, a spacious living room, and 4 bedrooms. It had all the modern amenities, including a fully equipped kitchen and a large TV. The friends settled in quickly, and after unpacking their bags, they sat down on the porch to enjoy the peaceful surroundings. As the night fell, they decided to make dinner and started cooking in the kitchen. The atmosphere was relaxed, and they chatted about their plans for the coming days. But as they sat down to eat, they heard a noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone was walking on the porch. They all looked at each other, startled. One of the friends, John, got up and went to investigate. He opened the front door and stepped outside. The porch was empty, and there was no sign of anyone around. John shrugged and went back inside, thinking it was just an animal or the wind. But as they sat down to eat again, they heard the noise once more. This time it was louder and more persistent. The friends decided to go outside together to investigate. They found footprints on the porch, leading towards the woods. They followed the footprints, thinking that maybe it was a lost hiker who needed help. But as they went deeper into the woods, the footprints disappeared and they found themselves lost. They started to feel uneasy and anxious, and the woods felt more sinister with every step they took. Suddenly, they heard a rustling sound behind them, and when they turned around, they saw a group of strangers emerging from the darkness. The strangers were dressed in dark clothes and had their faces covered with masks. They were carrying weapons, and their eyes gleamed with malice. The friends froze in terror, realizing they were in grave danger. One of the strangers spoke in a menacing tone. "Welcome to our territory. You are trespassing, and we don't take kindly to that." The friends tried to reason with them, but the strangers were relentless. They surrounded the friends and forced them to follow them deeper into the woods. The friends were terrified and had no idea what was going to happen to them. They walked for what felt like hours until they reached a small cabin in the middle of the woods. The cabin looked abandoned and had a foreboding aura around it. The strangers forced the friends inside and locked the door behind them. The friends were trapped, and they had no idea what was going to happen to them. They tried to find a way out, but the cabin was well secured, and there was no escape. As the night fell, the strangers started to torment the friends, subjecting them to physical and psychological torture. The friends felt like they were in a living nightmare, and they had no idea how to escape their tormentors. The friends were trapped in the cabin for several days, enduring the torture and abuse from the group of strangers. They had lost all hope of ever escaping and had resigned themselves to their fate. But one day they noticed that the strangers had let their guard down, and they saw an opportunity to escape. They waited until the strangers were distracted, and then they made a run for it. They ran through the woods, not caring where they were going as long as it was away from the cabin. They stumbled upon an old abandoned shed and decided to hide there until they could figure out their next move. As they were catching their breath, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the shed. They looked at each other, fear creeping up their spines. They knew that the strangers had found them and that their time was up. But to their surprise, it wasn't the strangers that had found them. It was a group of hikers who had stumbled upon the shed while exploring the woods. The friends were overjoyed at their luck and begged the hikers to take them to safety. The hikers were kind and understanding, and they immediately called the police to report the incident. The police arrived at the scene, and after a thorough investigation, they were able to arrest the group of strangers responsible for the friends' ordeal. The friends were relieved that they had escaped with their lives, but they were scared by the traumatic experience. They had nightmares for months, and they were never able to forget the horror they had endured. They never went on a vacation again, and they became more cautious and wary of strangers. The group of strangers were later revealed to be a cult that had been living in the woods for years, preying on unsuspecting tourists and hikers. They had been responsible for several disappearances over the years, but they had always managed to evade the authorities. But this time, they had been caught, and justice had been served. The friends were grateful for the hikers who had saved their lives, and they remained friends for life, bonded by the traumatic experience they had shared. They had learned a valuable lesson, never to take their safety for granted, and to always be cautious when traveling to unfamiliar places. Katya had always wanted to see Moscow. The Russian capital seemed like an exciting place, full of culture and history. So when she got a job offer there, she didn't hesitate to accept. She packed her bags and headed off to start her new life. The flat she rented was small but cozy. It was in a typical Soviet-era apartment building, with high ceilings and creaky floorboards. Katya liked the place, even though it was a bit far from the city center. She spent the first few days exploring the neighborhood and getting used to the local customs. One day, while she was unpacking, she heard a knock on the door. It was a man in his 40s, with a round face and a thin mustache. He introduced himself as Sergey, the building's maintenance man. He said he needed to check the gas pipes and asked to come inside. Katya hesitated for a moment, but then she remembered that the landlord had mentioned something about maintenance work. She let the man in and watched as he checked the pipes. Everything. "Seems fine," Sergey said finally. "Just one thing. You need to be careful with the locks. They're a bit old, and someone could break in if they wanted to." Katya nodded, feeling a bit uneasy. She thanked the man and watched as he left the flat. The first night in the flat was peaceful. Katya went to bed early, exhausted from the move. But the next day, strange things started happening. It started with small things. A cup that she had left on the table had moved to the other side of the room. The window that she had closed before going to bed was open when she woke up, but she brushed it off, thinking that she might have been too tired to remember. As the days went on, the strange happenings became more frequent. She would hear footsteps in the hallway at night, even though no one was there. The tap in the bathroom would turn on by itself, and the lights would flicker. Katya started to feel like she was being watched. She would turn around, expecting to see someone standing there. There was no one. She even started to lock the door from the inside, afraid that someone would break in. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a knock on the door. She hesitated for a moment, but then she remembered that it might be Sergey, the maintenance man. She opened the door, but there was no one there. She looked down the hallway, but it was empty. The final straw came one night when Katya woke up to find a man standing at the foot of her bed. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark hair. He was wearing a black suit and a red tie. Katya screamed, but the man just stood there, watching her. She tried to get out of bed, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear. The man started to walk towards her, slowly. Katya could hear his footsteps, loud and heavy. She closed her eyes, waiting for the worst. But then she heard another sound. It was the sound of the door opening. She opened her eyes, and the man was gone. She heard footsteps in the hallway, and then they faded away. Katya never found out who the man was or how he got into her flat. She moved out the next day, unable to stay in the place any longer. Katya reported the incident to the police, but they didn't seem too interested. They asked a few questions, took some notes, and promised to investigate. But nothing ever came of it. Feeling frustrated and alone, Katya decided to do some investigating of her own. She started by talking to the other residents of the building, hoping that someone had seen or heard something. But everyone seemed to be as clueless as she was. Then she remembered Sergey, the maintenance man. She had never seen him after that first visit, and she wondered if he knew anything. She asked around, and eventually, she found his phone number. When she called him, he seemed surprised to hear from her. She asked him about the incident, but he denied knowing anything about it. He said he had been out of town that night and hadn't been near her flat. Katya didn't believe him, but she didn't know what else to do. She decided to let it go and try to move on with her life. Part 5. The return several months later, Katya received a call from the landlord of her old flat. He said that he had received a complaint from a new tenant about strange happenings in the building. He asked if Katya knew anything about it. Katya felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that she had to do something. She decided to return to the building and investigate. As soon as she arrived, she could feel the same sense of unease that she had felt before. She walked down the hallway, and everything seemed the same as it had been before. But as she got closer to her old flat, she could hear strange noises coming from inside. She hesitated for a moment, but then she remembered why she had come. She opened the door, and the same sense of dread washed over her. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The furniture was covered in dust, and the air was stale. But something was different. She could feel a presence in the room, as if someone was watching her. She turned around, and there he was. The same man she had seen in her room that night. He was standing in the doorway, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. Katya tried to scream, but no sound came out. The The man started to walk towards her, slowly. She felt trapped, unable to move. But then she heard another sound. It was the sound of the door opening. She opened her eyes and the man was gone. She heard footsteps in the hallway, and then they faded away. Katya never found out who the man was or what he wanted, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never forget the horrors that she had experienced in that flat.